The neural link display flickered with the precision of 1,000 conquered civilizations, each represented by a dying star of light on the holographic map. Commander Vexera's genetic modifications allowed him to process the information with superhuman efficiency, 1,000 data points parsed in milliseconds, each conquest catalogued with clinical detachment. The Thorax flagship Titan Breaker was more than a vessel. It was a living testament to millennia of genetic engineering, a mobile archive of the most perfect warriors ever conceived. Its corridors pulsed with suspended animation chambers, each a carefully maintained ecosystem of genetic potential. Row after row of warriors hung in perfect stasis, their bodies a symphony of engineered muscle, enhanced neural pathways, and predetermined purpose. Vexera's own lineage was the culmination of 3,742 generations of selective breeding. Every cell in his body was a weapon, every thought a calculated strategy. His eyes, genetically modified to perceive electromagnetic spectrums far beyond human capability, scanned the holographic display with predatory intensity. Humanity was an anomaly, a statistical improbability that had somehow resisted the initial invasion attempts. Every other civilization had fallen within standard parameters, their resistance crushed, their potential absorbed or eliminated. But Earth was different. The communication intercepts were bizarre, unlike any pre-invasion transmissions that Thorax had ever encountered. Where other species sent desperate pleas or strategic communications, humans transmitted something entirely incomprehensible. Memes, dark humor, seemingly random bursts of communication that defied all known communication protocols. Deep within the Titan Breaker's genetic archives, Vexera reviewed the historical records. The Thorax had not just bred soldiers, they had systematically eradicated any species that showed signs of unpredictability. Creativity was a threat. Individual thought was a virus to be eliminated. The breeding program was both a science and a religious doctrine. Each generation was more than just improved. It was a sacred refinement. Weakness was culled with absolute precision. Emotions were reduced to tactical responses. Individual identity was replaced with collective purpose. A junior genetic analyst approached, her movements as precise as a machine. "Commander," she reported, "the latest human communication intercepts continue to defy our analytical models." Vexera's augmented brain processed her words, running multiple predictive scenarios simultaneously. The human transmissions were a puzzle, encrypted not with technology, but with layers of cultural references, irony, and psychological complexity that seemed to actively resist standard decryption. One particular intercept played on the neural display. A group of humans discussing an impending invasion, but not with fear. Instead, they traded jokes, made absurd preparations, shared memes that seemed to mock the very concept of their potential destruction. "Analyze," Vexera commanded. The ship's eye struggled, its predictive models fractured and recalibrated, unable to find standard patterns of resistance or surrender. What the Thorax didn't understand, what they could never understand, was that humanity's strength was not in genetic perfection. Their power lay in their beautiful, terrifying chaos, in their ability to transform weakness into strength, to find humor in the face of extinction, to create strategy from seemingly random individual actions. The Titan Breaker moved through the void, a weapon of absolute precision, but it was approaching a target that defied precision, a species that saw rigid perfection as a challenge to be dismantled. Humanity was coming, and nothing in the Thorax's millennia of genetic engineering could have prepared them for what was about to happen. Lieutenant Marcos Rodriguez watched the first wave of Thorax dropships descend through the cracked screen of a repurposed fire station command center. His team was nothing like the military units of past wars, a ragtag group of civilians turned defenders, each bringing a unique brand of chaos to their resistance. To his left, Alina Cho, a 19-year-old competitive esports player, was frantically typing into a modified gaming rig. Her fingers danced across multiple keyboards, each connected to a different network system. "I'm in their comms," she muttered, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "They have no idea how vulnerable their network is." Next to her, Marcus Green, a 68-year-old retired electrical engineer, was busy rewiring what looked like a collection of consumer-grade drones and industrial equipment. These precision-guided missiles, he chuckled, weren't exactly designed for this kind of modification. The first Thorax landing units were a marvel of genetic engineering. Each soldier was a perfect organism, muscles optimized for maximum efficiency, neural pathways designed for instantaneous tactical processing, reflexes beyond human comprehension. They moved in perfect synchronization, their equipment a testament to technological superiority. They never stood a chance. As the first squad approached a suburban neighborhood, they encountered something completely outside their tactical algorithms. A group of teenagers had transformed a local strip mall into a defensive position that defied all military logic. Lawn equipment became weapons. Barbecue propane tanks were rigged as makeshift rocket launchers. Garden hoses became sophisticated cooling systems for improvised electronic warfare equipment. Rodriguez keyed his comm system. "Neighborhood watch, you are go." What happened next would be studied by military historians for generations. Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcos's 72-year-old mother, led a group of local retirees who had transformed their community watch program into a terrifyingly effective resistance cell. They used group text messages, neighborhood Facebook groups, and decades of local knowledge to create a defensive network that was invisible to traditional military scanning. A Thorax tactical unit attempting to breach a residential block found themselves navigating a nightmare of misdirection. Sprinkler systems suddenly activated with chemical irritants. Garage doors opened and closed at random. Wireless speakers blasted conflicting audio signals that disrupted their communication arrays. Alina's hacking went beyond simple network intrusion. She was actively feeding the Thorax tactical systems with deliberately contradictory information. Their perfectly calibrated battle algorithms began to fracture, unable to process the sheer randomness of human response. "They're trying to apply logic to chaos," Marcus observed, watching the tactical displays. "But chaos doesn't follow rules." A Thorax commander would later report that their first wave encountered tactical impossibilities. How does a military unit trained for absolute precision respond when elderly women use garden gnomes as impromptu signal jammers? When high school students turn smartphone apps into distributed warfare platforms? The first hour of invasion looked nothing like any previous conquest in Thorax history. Their soldiers, genetically perfect, technologically superior, found themselves outmaneuvered by a species that saw warfare as an improvisational art form. Rodriguez allowed himself a slight smile. The Thorax had no idea what was coming. Humanity was about to show them the true meaning of adaptation. The Mimetic Warfare Division assembled in a converted comic book store basement, a location so absurd it became the perfect strategic headquarters. Dr. Sarah Nakamura, the team's lead psychologist, looked over her most unusual group of recruits. These weren't soldiers. They were humanity's most dangerous weapon. Professional internet trolls, conspiracy theorists, viral content creators, and social media chaos agents. "Welcome to your military service," she announced, pulling up a holographic display of Thorax communication networks. Jack Quantum Troll Martinez, a 27-year-old who had previously made a living destabilizing online communities, grinned. "You're telling me my entire career of causing maximum chaos is now a legitimate military strategy?" The room erupted in nervous laughter. The Thorax had a critical weakness they couldn't comprehend. They had bred out individual thoughts so completely that they became vulnerable to psychological manipulation beyond their understanding. Each super soldier was a perfect tactical unit, but they were fundamentally incapable of processing humor, irony, or intentional misinformation. Dr. Nakamura outlined their primary objectives. "We're going to break their communication networks using the most powerful weapon humanity has ever created, our ability to turn anything into a joke." The first wave of attacks was subtle. Orcs communication channels began receiving transmissions that defied all logical communication protocols. Endless loops of cat videos, deliberately nonsensical memes, complex conspiracy theories that seemingly had no purpose, recursive jokes that broke standard communication parsing algorithms. A Orcs communication officer watched in growing confusion as their most secure channels became flooded with human cultural artifacts that made no tactical sense. A video of a cat playing piano would suddenly interrupt a military transmission. Complex mathematical equations would be interspersed with dad jokes. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Orcs soldiers, bred for absolute emotional control, began experiencing something terrifying. Cognitive dissonance. Their perfectly engineered neural pathways couldn't process the intentional randomness of human communication. Elena Cho, now working directly with the Memetic Warfare Division, had developed advanced algorithms that turned internet humor into a weapon. "It's not just about sending messages," she explained. "It's about sending messages that actively resist interpretation." One particularly effective transmission involved a multi-layered meme that simultaneously referenced 1980s pop culture, quantum physics, cat videos, existential philosophy. When decoded, it contained no actual information, but it completely paralyzed Orcs communication systems trying to parse its meaning. Jack Martinez discovered his true calling. He could craft a single social media post that would spread through Orcs networks like a virus, causing their most advanced AI systems to crash in confusion. "I've been preparing for this my entire life," he told Dr. Nakamura. "The internet was just my training ground." The psychological warfare went deeper. They began introducing complex moral paradoxes into Orcs communication networks, philosophical thought experiments that challenged the very concept of their genetic programming, questions that had no logical answer, but which demanded resolution. Commander Vexera watched in growing horror as his perfectly engineered communication networks began to fragment. The Orcs had never encountered an enemy that could weaponize nonsense. Humanity wasn't just fighting a war. They were conducting a psychological experiment in real time, proving that their greatest strength was their ability to turn anything, even their most chaotic elements, into a strategic weapon. The real invasion was just beginning. The abandoned shopping mall had become humanity's most unlikely military installation. Spread across multiple floors, teams worked with a mixture of cutting-edge technology and absolute improvisation. This was the heart of humanity's most unconventional weapon: absolute, weaponized chaos. Lieutenant Marcos Rodriguez stood at the center of a massive operations room, surrounded by screens showing everything from global communication networks to localized resistance movements. To his left, a group of teenagers manipulated holographic displays. To his right, retired military veterans worked alongside conspiracy theorists and social media experts. "Operation Trojan Meme is go," Elena Cho announced, her fingers dancing across multiple interfaces. The plan was audacious. They weren't just going to fight the Orcs. They were going to completely deconstruct their entire social and military infrastructure. Dr. Aisha Khalid, a behavioral psychologist specializing in computational propaganda, explained the strategy. The Orcs have spent millennia breeding out individual thought. We're going to reintroduce it, violently and completely. Their primary targets were the Orcs breeding facilities, not with conventional weapons, but with information designed to create maximum psychological disruption. Jack Martinez had developed what he called viral cognitive payloads, information packages designed to cause maximum confusion. Each payload was a complex mixture of philosophical paradoxes, deliberately contradictory information, cultural references that made no sense to a species without individual context, psychological triggers designed to introduce doubt. The first wave hit like a tsunami of nonsense. Orcs communication networks began receiving transmissions that defied all logical interpretation. A single meme could contain layers of meaning that would take their most advanced AI weeks to partially decode. Each transmission was designed to introduce the most terrifying concept to a genetically engineered race: individual doubt. One particularly effective payload introduced the concept of personal choice through a series of increasingly complex thought experiments. It wasn't just information. It was a virus of individuality. The breeding facilities were the most vulnerable. Each genetic line, carefully maintained for thousands of years, began to experience microscopic variations. A single transmission could introduce genetic mutations that would propagate through entire generations. Rodriguez watched the initial reports come in. The Orcs weren't just experiencing military defeat, they were experiencing an existential crisis. "We're not just fighting a war," he told Dr. Khalid. "We're conducting a species-wide deprogramming." The most shocking weapon was almost too simple to be believed. A group of human psychologists and linguists had developed communication packages that introduced the most dangerous concept to the Orcs: the idea that they could choose their own purpose. Each transmission was a precisely crafted intellectual bomb. It didn't just challenge the Orcs' understanding, it completely dismantled their entire conceptual framework. Commander Vexera, monitoring from the Titan Breaker, began to experience something his genetic line had never been programmed to understand. Fear, not the tactical fear of defeat, but the existential fear of losing one's predetermined purpose. The humans weren't just resisting. They were rewriting the very concept of resistance. As the first signs of genetic and psychological breakdown began to spread through the Orc systems, humanity prepared for the next phase of their impossible war. The most dangerous weapon was never a gun or a missile. It was the simple, terrifying concept of individual choice. The first Orc soldier to experience true individual thought was designated Operative 7329 Gamma. It happened during a routine patrol of a recently conquered Earth sector, a moment that would be recorded as the first true crack in the millennia-old Orcs genetic legacy. A discarded street performer's juggling ball caught 7329 Gamma's enhanced peripheral vision. Something about the object's random trajectories triggered a cascade of neural responses that were never supposed to happen. For the first time, the operative experienced something beyond its programmed parameters: curiosity. Dr. Sarah Nakamura and her team had been preparing for this exact moment. The psychological warfare wasn't just about external communication. It was a precisely engineered virus of individuality, designed to exploit the tiniest genetic vulnerabilities in the Orcs breeding program. "We're not fighting a war," she had told Rodriguez earlier. "We're conducting the most elaborate deprogramming in galactic history." The Orcs had spent millennia eliminating any genetic line that showed signs of individual thought. They had created soldiers so perfectly controlled that the concept of personal choice was literally bred out of their genetic code. But humanity understood something fundamental. Suppression is not elimination. Operative 7329 Gamma picked up the juggling ball. The action itself was a rebellion, an act completely outside its tactical programming. For the first time, a question formed that was not a tactical assessment. Why? Across the planet, similar moments were happening simultaneously. Each Orc soldier began experiencing microscopic breaks in their genetic conditioning. A soldier might pause to watch a street cat. Another might hesitate before following a direct order. Small moments of individual awareness that spread like a genetic wildfire. Commander Vexera watched in growing horror as his perfectly engineered military began to fragment. The communication logs became increasingly bizarre. Tactical reports were interrupted by what could only be described as existential musings. One report read, "Tactical assessment incomplete. Observe human child sharing food with injured street animal. Purpose unclear. Emotional response unexpected." The Orcs breeding facilities became ground zero for the breakdown. Genetic lines that had been carefully maintained for thousands of years began to show unprecedented variations. Where once there was perfect uniformity, now there was individuality. Jack Martinez, monitoring the communications, couldn't help but laugh. "We're literally trolling an entire alien species into self-awareness," he told Elena Cho. The most dangerous transmission was deceptively simple, a collection of human stories, not strategic reports, not tactical information, but narratives of individual choice, of personal sacrifice, of unexpected kindness. Each story was a precision-guided intellectual missile designed to introduce the most terrifying concept to a race bred for absolute control: the idea that they could choose their own purpose. Operative 7329 Gamma looked at the juggling ball and, for the first time, made a decision entirely its own. It pocketed the ball, an action with no tactical purpose, no strategic value. Just a moment of pure individual choice. The Xorax military command watched in growing panic as their perfect soldiers began to do the most impossible thing. They began to think for themselves. Rodriguez understood the true nature of their war. They weren't just fighting an invasion. They were conducting a species-wide liberation. The perfect soldiers were breaking. And in their breaking, they were becoming something entirely new. The converted data center hummed with an energy that was equal parts scientific precision and controlled chaos. Lieutenant Marcos Rodriguez stood at the epicenter of humanity's most audacious plan, a multi-layered attack designed to completely dismantle the Xorax civilization from within. Dr. Aisha Khalid's team had been working for months, developing what they called the Trojan Genome Project. It wasn't a weapon in any traditional sense. It was a meticulously crafted virus of potential, a genetic and mimetic payload designed to introduce the most dangerous concept to the Xorax: true individual choice. "We're not just fighting," Rodriguez explained to the assembled team. "We're conducting a species-wide liberation." The strategy was breathtakingly complex. They would target the Xorax breeding facilities, not with conventional weapons, but with a multi-layered attack that would simultaneously introduce genetic variations, broadcast psychological destabilization signals, create information networks that would spread individual thought, systematically undermine the Xorax's entire social and genetic infrastructure. Elena Cho had developed a series of algorithmic payloads that could slip through the most sophisticated Xorax communication filters. Each transmission was a carefully crafted mix of philosophical thought experiments, cultural narratives of individual choice, genetic modification vectors, psychological triggers designed to create cognitive dissonance. Jack Martinez's team focused on the mimetic warfare. They created information packages that were part communication, part psychological virus. A single meme could now carry genetic modification potential, psychological destabilization triggers, and complex philosophical challenges. The first target was the primary Xorax breeding facility on their home world. Traditionally impenetrable, it was a fortress of genetic engineering, a place where entire generations were carefully cultivated, modified, and prepared for specific purposes. They would transform it from the inside out. Dr. Khalid explained the core of their strategy. The Xorax believe they've eliminated individual thought, but suppression is not elimination. We're going to show them the difference. The attack would come in waves. First, a series of communication disruptions. Then, carefully crafted genetic modification vectors, followed by psychological destabilization signals. Finally, a complete reconstruction of their understanding of purpose and individual potential. Rodriguez knew they were doing more than fighting an invasion. They were conducting the most elaborate deprogramming in galactic history. The Xorax had spent millennia creating the perfect soldier, a being so precisely engineered that individual thought was considered a genetic defect. Humanity was about to show them the true power of individual potential. "We're not just defeating them," Rodriguez told his team. "We're giving them a choice they've never had before." Commander Vexera, monitoring from the Titan Breaker, began to realize the true nature of the human strategy. This wasn't a conventional war. This was a complete reimagining of what it meant to be an individual, a society, a species. The first wave of the attack would begin in precisely 47 minutes, a multi-layered assault that would introduce more than just resistance. It would introduce the concept of freedom itself. Humanity's most dangerous weapon was never a gun or a missile. It was the simple, terrifying idea that every being has the potential to choose its own purpose. The destruction of the Orcs civilization began not with a thunderous battle, but with a moment of quiet revelation. Operative 7329 Gamma stood in the central breeding facility, surrounded by millennia of genetic engineering infrastructure. Rows of suspended animation chambers stretched into infinity, each a testament to the Orcs' obsession with genetic perfection. But something had changed. The chambers were no longer uniform. Slight variations began to appear, microscopic differences that would have been unthinkable mere weeks ago. Commander Vexera watched from the Titan Breaker's command center as his entire civilization began to unravel. The communication networks that had once been a model of perfect efficiency now buzzed with something terrifying: individual conversations. As Orcs soldiers began to do the unthinkable, they asked questions. They hesitated. They made choices that defied their genetic programming. A transmission came through that would have been impossible before. Purpose requires choice. Choice requires understanding. Understanding requires individual thought. Lieutenant Marcos Rodriguez and his team monitored the collapse with a mixture of scientific fascination and profound empathy. This wasn't a conquest. It was a liberation. Dr. Aisha Khalid explained the phenomenon to her colleagues. "We didn't defeat them," she said. "We gave them the most dangerous gift in the universe: the ability to choose their own path." The genetic lines that had been carefully maintained for thousands of years began to fragment and reconstruct themselves. Where once there was perfect uniformity, now there was diversity. Individual thoughts spread like a beautiful, terrifying virus. Entire battalions of Orcs soldiers began to stand down, not out of fear, but out of a newfound understanding. They were experiencing something their entire civilization had suppressed for millennia: the concept of personal agency. Jack Martinez, watching the communication networks, couldn't help but laugh. "We literally trolled an entire species into self-awareness," he told Elena Cho. The breeding facilities became ground zero of the transformation. Genetic modification vectors introduced by human psychological warfare teams began to create unprecedented variations. Each chamber now contained something unique, not a perfect soldier, but a potential individual. Commander Vexera was the first to broadcast a message of surrender. But it wasn't a traditional surrender. It was a declaration of a new possibility. "We were wrong." The transmission read, "Perfection is not uniformity. Perfection is the potential for individual growth." The Titan Breaker, once a symbol of galactic domination, now became a beacon of transformation. Its communication arrays, once used to coordinate invasions, now transmitted something entirely new: stories of individual choice, of personal discovery, of the infinite potential of being. Operative 7329 Gamma looked at the juggling ball, the symbol of its first moment of individual choice. Now it represented something more. A reminder that true strength comes not from genetic engineering, but from the ability to choose one's own path. The Orcs civilization didn't fall. It transformed. Humanity had done more than resist an invasion. They had introduced an entire species to the most dangerous, most beautiful concept in the universe: the right to become something more than what you were originally designed to be. The universe watched in awe as a civilization learned to choose its own destiny. 10 years after the transformation, the former Orcs breeding facility had become something entirely unexpected: a university of individual potential. Lieutenant Marcos Rodriguez walked through the converted complex, watching former super soldiers learn the most fundamental human skills, not combat techniques, but the art of making personal choices. Art classes sat next to philosophy workshops. Former tactical units were learning pottery, creative writing, and quantum mechanics. Operative 7329 Gamma, now simply known as Zara, approached Rodriguez. Her movement was no longer the perfect, calculated stride of a genetically engineered soldier, but the relaxed gait of someone who had discovered the joy of individual movement. "We are still learning," Zara said, holding the juggling ball that had been her first symbol of individual choice. Unlearning is sometimes more difficult than learning. The Galactic community watched in fascination. The Exorax transformation became the most studied sociological event in recorded history. Dr. Aisha Khalid's research team documented every aspect of the species' remarkable journey from genetic determinism to individual agency. The Lena Cho had developed an entire field of study, mimetic liberation theory. Her work explored how information, carefully crafted, could be a tool of profound social transformation. Universities across multiple planets now studied her groundbreaking research. Jack Martinez, somewhat to his own surprise, became a key advisor in cross-cultural communication. The skills he had developed as an internet troll became a sophisticated understanding of how information could bridge seemingly impossible cultural divides. The Exorax didn't just integrate into human society. They began to redefine the concept of society itself. Their journey became a beacon of hope for other species trapped in rigid social structures. Rodriguez reflected on the true nature of their victory. They hadn't conquered the Exorax. They had helped them discover themselves. The breeding facilities that once produced perfect soldiers now produced something far more powerful, individuals with the ability to choose their own path. Each former soldier was now a student of possibility, learning that strength was not about uniformity, but about the infinite potential of individual growth. Zara showed Rodriguez a painting she had created, her first artistic expression. It was a chaotic mixture of colors, nothing like the precise, mathematically perfect designs of her previous existence. "I am learning," she said, "that imperfection is its own kind of beauty." The Titanbreaker, once a symbol of galactic domination, had been transformed into a museum of transformation. Its halls now told the story of a species that learned the most important lesson in the universe: that true potential lies not in perfection, but in the ability to choose to grow, to become something more than what you were designed to be. Humanity had done more than resist an invasion. They had introduced an entire species to the most dangerous, most beautiful concept in the universe: the right to write your own story. As the sun set on the converted breeding facility, Rodriguez understood that this was more than a victory of one species over another. This was a victory of individual potential over systematic suppression. The universe had learned a critical lesson: never underestimate a species that can turn its most chaotic elements into a force of profound transformation. Zara looked at Rodriguez and smiled, an expression that would have been impossible for her a decade ago. "We choose," she said simply. "And in choosing, we become."